everyone, today I'm coming with a video from my kitchen. So today we're going to be talking about hyperpalatable type foods and how you can make maybe a simple single ingredient food very palatable, and how this relates to times when we're dieting versus times when we're trying to maintain our weight versus times where people are actually trying to put on weight. So let's get straight into the video. Firstly, I want to talk to you a little bit about food volume. So we have 50 calories here. And as you can see, we have 50 calories worth of broccoli, a massive bowl full of fiber, very, very filling food. However, we've also got 50 calories worth of Easter eggs, which you can see are 2 little mini chocolate eggs. So we already know straight away that this bowl here is going to fill us up a lot more for the calories. So when dieting, it's truly important that we focus on very filling, single ingredient type foods in order to ensure that we feel full when we are dieting. What this is going to do is ensure that we don't overconsume and therefore overshoot our energy requirements, because obviously when we're dieting, we need to be in a caloric deficit. One thing to note is that we know that this is quite a bland type food. We know that at some point we're going to get very bored of this and essentially we're going to stop eating it. We're going to feel full. There's going to be not much drive to eat it. However, this is what we call a non-palatable type food. There is no real kind of sense or drive to overconsume it. However, we can then add a fat source. So if I add some extra mature cheese to this bowl of broccoli, all of a sudden we have a fat source which makes it a lot more palatable and therefore a lot more tasty. Therefore, I would be more inclined to overconsume the broccoli. Another example of this would be tuna. Tuna is a single ingredient type food. It doesn't have a high palatable type overdrive for us to want to overconsume it. We'd only be able to consume so much before we got full and therefore bored of the taste. However, if I add something such as like a sauce to this meal or some kind of salsa type ingredient, we all of a sudden add something that makes it more palatable. It makes it more tasty. So these are quite like low calorie sauces for the amount that you can use per volume, which is great. And that is something I would say to utilize when dieting. Use lower caloric sauces such as, ketchup, such as mild salsa, teriyaki sauce, soy sauce, for example. However, if we are then able to add a fat sauce to this, so all of a sudden we have the tuna and we have it with mayonnaise, that then is going to make this tuna a lot more palatable, therefore a lot more, give us a lot more of a drive to want to overconsume it. When dieting, that's just something that we need to be overly aware about, because if we want to manage our caloric intakes, then we need to be aware of if we are going to overconsume a food. Another example of this would be something such as chicken breast. When we have chicken breast and we just kind of season it, maybe with some rosemary, dried thyme, some dried herbs and spices, all of a sudden that chicken breast is tasty enough to want to consume it, but isn't going to force us or kind of drive us to want to consume it in huge amounts. However, if we add such as like a kind of lower caloric sauce to it, such as something like a barbecue type sauce, we all of a sudden can eat a lot more chicken than just the herb version of that chicken. And then if we kind of add something even further, so all of a sudden we put it in a like katsu curry, for example, all of a sudden we can consume that chicken in larger amounts. And obviously the caloric differences between spicing your chicken with some kind of herbs and spices versus adding a sauce versus adding kind of like a fat sauce changes quite drastically. So when dieting, it's very important that we look to make our foods something that's going to really, really fill us up, but still meet our calorie requirements and not drive us to want to overconsume it because of the taste sensations of mixing usually a carbohydrate sauce with a fat sauce. And you can do the same obviously with a protein sauce. If you have like a protein sauce and you mix it with something that has a fat sauce but also has maybe some sugars in it, then all of a sudden that drive to want to consume more of it is a lot higher. So it's just something to be aware of when dieting. If we're going to use a lot of kind of like coconut milk type sauces, then obviously that is going to bump calories up and make that meal a lot more like a huger drive to eat that more of that meal. So something to be aware of, and therefore help with kind of managing hunger, but managing also the drive to want to overconsume when dieting. What I want to talk as well about is how much of a particular food you require in order to be satisfied. So if I put a block of chocolate in front of you, how much of this block of chocolate would you require in order to hit that sweet spot and therefore be able to kind of stop and say, I've had enough? And this is quite an interesting experiment, because if you put a block like this, which is milk chocolate, it only contains 49% minimum cocoa value, cocoa solids. So it's still quite a very low cocoa solid chocolate. It's very much on that kind of milk chocolate kind of spectrum, considering we can get up to kind of 70, 75, 80% cocoa content, and we know that that is classed more as a dark chocolate. If I was to put 2 blocks of chocolate in front of you and say, how much of this block could you consume and how much of an 85% could you consume, where would the difference in the amounts that you consume be? I reckon for most people, the amount that they could consume in an 85% cocoa solid chocolate would be a lot lower than how much they could consume of this block being a milk chocolate. And that comes back to the sugar content, so how sweet that food is. There's obviously nothing wrong with sugar, but obviously it will once again increase our drive to want to overconsume. And we just need to always be aware of that. And with all kind of sweet type foods, hyperpalatable type foods, they come with a mix of ingredients. And usually those two mixes are basically a carbohydrate and a fat. And that kind of gives us that pleasure, enjoyable taste. And we know that with chocolate as well, because the main ingredients in this kind of plain chocolate is sugar as its first ingredient, and then obviously cocoa mass, which is a type of fat source. And the mixture essentially of this block is, per 100 grams, is carbohydrates 51, fat 31 grams. So we can see there's kind of a good mix between carbohydrates and fats there, and that's what gives it that really enjoyable taste that wants us to overconsume it. So that's just something we need to be aware of, how much of something that we require in order to enjoy it. And we know that if you were to have this block and you were to eat this block, the first couple of bites, first couple of pieces of this block would taste amazing. However, if you got down to the last couple of pieces of this block, it wouldn't have that same pleasure these first couple of blocks had. One extra thing to note as well is the more flavors we add to a particular type of food, the more or the longer it takes for us to hit that point of satiation, or that point of I've had enough, this taste now doesn't have that same excitement those first couple of bites did. So if I was to give an example of that, if I was to have just a plain chocolate, that would be fine. I would, have so many bites, and then I would kind of, the enjoyment factor would start to decrease because I'd become immune to that initial response. However, if I add, say, some salted caramel pieces into this chocolate, I add another flavor. So I've got chocolate on top of salted caramel. So therefore, all of a sudden, I need further amounts of pieces in order to get that sweet spot of I've had enough, and the kind of enjoyment factor is no longer there, or it's starting to decrease. So just to note, obviously the more flavors you add to something, the further or longer it's going to take for you to hit that point of diminishing kind of returns, so it starts to not taste as good. If you are going to eat a food that is hyper palatable, you really need to make sure that you tune into exactly what you're doing. So we all know that we all enjoy chocolate. However, we need to make sure that we're very mindful around how much we have of it, where that sweet spot is, because it will get to a point where it starts to not be as enjoyable as those first couple of bites. There's really at that point no point in continuing. You're better off stopping, enjoying and savoring the amount that you require to hit that sweet spot, and then enjoying some more the next day when that sweet response is going to return. And comes back to the same as when you're out for a meal, for example. If you order a dessert, we know that some desserts can be extremely rich, and we can get to a point where, you know, we have that first couple of mouthfuls and we're like, wow, this tastes absolutely amazing. But then, you know, halfway through we start to get to a point where like, this is not as good as it was in those first couple of bites. And then a lot of the time we can get to the point of the end of the dessert, we've finished it and we go, now I feel quite sick, like it's just too much, it's too dense, too heavy, too sickly, too sweet. So it really is important when we are having foods, especially when dieting, that we tune in to what our response is, what our taste buds are telling us, what our sources are kind of telling us, our brain's telling us about where that sweet spot is for us and when we need to save the rest for later or call it a day. So that kind of wraps up my video on hyper palatable type foods. And just a reminder is basically when dieting, you need to be very, very aware of the foods that you are eating and how you pair them. So for example, if you are having a plain kind of type food, you just need to make sure how you pair that is really, really important. What you pair that with to make that kind of drive or overconsumption happen. Same when it comes to foods that are very, very tasty, the foods that we all enjoy. We need to very much tune in to how much of that food we require in order to get that sweet spot. And then after that, we need to stop and enjoy the rest later, or essentially call it a day and stop eating that food. It doesn't mean that you can't have more the next day, but you'll actually get more enjoyment out of it. So it very much comes back to finding that kind of minimal dose of enjoyment, where that point is for you, how much of that food you require, and being very much in tune to that. When it comes to dieting, the aim of the game is to basically get yourself full, and that requires food volume, so the broccoli versus the chocolate situation. It also comes back to making your foods tasty enough, but not so tasty that there's too much of a drive to overconsume them. And when it comes to hyper palatable type foods, we need to tune in to exactly how much of that food we require, how much kind of calories it's going to set us back, and when that enjoyment factor starts to dissipate. I hope this video has been educational. I hope it's been really important to kind of give you some insight into some dieting tips and awareness. Thank you very much for listening.